It was to be just another unprecedented first-class flight, a time to relax, unwind, and get away from the stresses of everyday life. For most of the passengers on board, flying in the front cabin was an opportunity to enjoy luxury with plush seats, gourmet meals, and attentive service. Little did they realize that the flight would soon become the site of an unforgettable showdown, triggered by one man's careless arrogance. As the plane took to the skies, passengers settled into their seats, sipping drinks and leafing through in-flight magazines. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering warm smiles and service with impeccable precision. Most were lost in their own worlds, unaware of the tension that was slowly building in the cabin. One particular passenger, however, was about to make a fatal mistake. A man who clearly loved the sound of his own voice. He was a businessman, dressed in an expensive suit, sitting comfortably in a window seat, oblivious to the fact that his loud, brash comments were annoying the other passengers around him. He was cocky and full of self-importance, convinced that he was more important than everyone else on the airplane. He started bragging loudly, talking about his supposed knowledge of sports and his past experiences with professional athletes. But as the minutes went by, his words turned from mere bragging to outright disrespect. He didn't hold back when it came to mocking world-renowned athletes, hurling insults as if they were nothing more than garbage. "These guys are overrated," he declared. "What's so special about Khabib? He's just fighting to win. You could easily beat him if you had the right strategy." His voice echoed around the cabin, and while some passengers exchanged awkward glances, the man didn't seem to realize the gravity of his words. His laughter filled the air, but it was an empty laugh, the kind that comes from a man too ignorant to realize the consequences of his actions. What this man didn't know was that he was about to face a man who would not tolerate his disrespect. The first-class cabin of the private jet was the perfect embodiment of modern luxury. As the plane soared into the skies, the atmosphere inside remained calm and serene, in stark contrast to the tumultuous world below. The wide, soft leather seats were arranged in an elegant arrangement, each of which offered the kind of space and comfort you expect from the highest level of air travel. The soft, muted colors of the decor, deep navy blue, rich cream, and polished wood trim, created a feeling of warmth and sophistication. Even the hand luggage compartments were built into the sleek design, flush with the walls, giving the cabin a clean and uncluttered look. Passengers sprawled in their seats. Some reclined, throwing a blanket over their legs. Others immersed themselves in books, tablets, or laptops. The hum of the jet engines, though ever present, was a soothing background noise that barely disturbed the peace. The gentle rocking of the plane enhanced the feeling of weightlessness, as if the cabin floated in a world separate from the chaos below. It was a sanctuary in the sky where luxury was not just a promise, but a tangible presence. The flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisle. Their uniforms were neat and spotless, the image of professionalism and efficiency. They offered drinks, filled glasses, and handed out gourmet meals. Every detail was meticulously planned to ensure that the passengers got everything they needed. There was no rush, no stress. Everything was executed with the utmost care, creating an experience so smooth that it almost felt as if time had slowed down. There was a quiet hum of conversation among the passengers, the sort of polite exchange of remarks one would expect from people accustomed to a certain level of privilege. Some were making business deals, some were just chatting about personal matters, and some were silently enjoying the luxury of their surroundings. The atmosphere was decidedly refined, with the unspoken realization that the people in this cabin were used to the things in life. At the front of the cabin, Khabib Nurmagomedov sat in one of the window seats. His posture was relaxed, but reserved. Despite his towering good looks and undefeated reputation as one of the most dominant mixed martial arts fighters in UFC history, Khabib was dressed simply: athletic pants, a hooded sweatshirt and sneakers. There was no flashy clothing, no attempt to draw attention. He didn't need it. His presence alone was enough to command respect, though he didn't show it in any way, preferring instead to remain down to earth. His face was calm, eyes focused on the pages of a book, absorbed in the quiet solitude of the moment. Khabib had always been a man of few words man, but when he spoke, it was with a purpose. Right now, he was content to just let the hours pass. The other first-class passengers were equally absorbed in their own worlds. The businesswoman across the aisle was tapping away on her laptop, working on an important deal. The couple in the seat next to her sat in cozy silence. Each of them was immersed in their own thoughts, occasionally glancing out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. Another man in an austere suit, clearly in his 50s, was adjusting his glasses, leafing through a magazine, occasionally glancing at his watch. Despite their wealth and status, they all enjoyed the same luxury, unadulterated, uninterrupted comfort. But amidst this tranquility, one man stood out. His voice was louder than necessary. He sat a few rows ahead, a middle-aged man with a strong accent, wearing a brightly colored suit and a look of smugness. His name was irrelevant, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He spoke with exaggerated confidence, as if his opinion was the only thing that mattered. As he spoke of his past exploits with athletes and his supposed expertise in various sports, it quickly became apparent that he was trying to impress those around him. At first, his words were innocuous, comments about his experiences attending live games and his so-called connections with athletes. But soon his conversation took a more strident turn. He began mocking professional fighters, bragging about his ability to put down anyone in the octagon. He mocked the accomplishments of legendary athletes, brushing them off with a look of superiority. But when the conversation turned to Khabib, it was clear he had no filter, no boundaries. "What's all the hype about Khabib?" he said loudly, barely glancing at the people listening. "This guy is just a fighter. He's overrated. I bet anyone in this cabin could put him down if they knew how to fight right. He doesn't stand a chance outside of the UFC." His word hung in the air, a defiant challenge. The booth, once filled with quiet mutterings and polite exchanges, seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of comment that caught the attention of everyone nearby, but no one dared to confront him directly. Some passengers exchanged awkward glances, silently wondering if anyone would speak up, but no one did. The man's voice, oozing arrogance, continued to fill the space. Khabib, still quietly reading his book, remained unperturbed at first. He didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the insult. He was used to criticism, even louder criticism. But as the man's words grew bolder, as he continued to belittle the man who had built a legacy of violence, discipline, and honor, something in Khabib's demeanor subtly changed. His eyes slowly lifted from the page, and for a brief moment he looked around the room. His gaze stopped on the man who had dared to insult him. It was a quiet shift, but it was palpable. The tension in the cabin, already tight because of the man's impertinent words, seemed to hang in the air even more. The other passengers, sensing that something was about to happen, held their breath, as if the room were the calm before the storm. And then, without a word, Khabib stood up. The steady hum of the airplane was suddenly deafening in the silence. All eyes turned to him. The businessman's voice trembled as Khabib headed down the aisle toward him. His steps were measured and unhurried. There was no anger in his movements, no sign of aggression, only an aura of undeniable presence. He walked calm and collected, but his every movement seemed to carry the weight of something far greater than the moment itself. The tension in the cabin peaked. The man, still unaware of the seriousness of the situation, grinned and turned to Khabib with a smug look, clearly expecting his taunts to continue. The silence that followed was unbearable. All eyes were fixed on them. As Khabib made his way toward the man, the tension in the cabin became almost unbearable. The once serene atmosphere, filled with quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of glass, was now filled with anticipation. All eyes followed Khabib, who moved with a quiet confidence that made the entire cabin freeze. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, when you feel that something important is about to happen. The man, still blissfully unaware of the seriousness of his situation, remained smug. A smug grin stretched across his face. He squirmed in his seat, adjusting himself to Khabib, fully convinced that the UFC champion wouldn't make a move. After all, who would? He was just a random fighter, right? This was a top-notch one. After all, rich and powerful people didn't settle disputes in such a raw way, but there was something about Khabib's approach that made him question his own arrogance. When Khabib stopped a few feet away from him, the cabin became dead quiet. The only sound now was the faint hum of the airplane's engines, which seemed to be lost in the growing tension. The man let out a short, dismissive laugh, trying to maintain his bravado, but the worry in his voice was beginning to show. He straightened, but his eyes gave him away. He began to realize that the man standing in front of him was not someone he could easily ignore. "Who do you think you are?" The man grinned, trying to keep the situation under control. His voice was shaking now, but he wasn't ready to back down. "You really think I'm afraid of you, huh?" Khabib's gaze was unwavering, his eyes dark and piercing. His silence wasn't intimidation, but something deeper. He didn't need to say a word to show that he was in complete control of the situation. Every step he took, every movement he made, seemed calculated and deliberate. He didn't stride forward with clenched fists or an angry look, making this man's bravado seem more and more ridiculous by the second. Tilting his head slightly, Khabib spoke in a calm, measured voice that commanded respect without raising the volume. "You should be more careful with your words." The words sounded like thunder. The arrogance that defined this man's demeanor shook. His smug expression vanished as he looked into Khabib's eyes. For the first time he realized who he was dealing with. The towering figure, the quiet intensity, the calm but unnerving presence. This wasn't just any UFC fighter standing before him. This was a man who had conquered the biggest stage in combat sports, a man whose composure had been tested in the most extreme circumstances. This was not just someone he could mock for fun. The man's face began to lose color. He fidgeted nervously in his seat, trying to regain some semblance of his former cocky posture. But it was no use. He was no longer in control of the situation. Only Khabib's presence controlled him. But it wasn't just fear crawling into his chest. It was the realization all the noise he had made about the fighters and their abilities was nothing more than empty bravado. He had unknowingly entered a realm where words didn't matter, where respect was earned by actions, not arrogance. The other passengers, who had been watching the altercation with bated breath, sensed a change in the air. No one dared to speak. No one dared to intervene. Everyone waited, wondering what Khabib would do next. Would he confront the man physically? Will the insults escalate into something more dangerous? Or will he simply walk away, allowing the man to languish in his own embarrassment? But Khabib's reaction, or lack thereof, was what really stunned everyone. He didn't need to raise his voice or make an example of the man through violence. The weight of his silence, the calmness in his eyes spoke more than any outburst of anger. In a world where strength was often measured by how loudly someone could assert themselves, Khabib was a testament to the power of quiet confidence and discipline. The man, now clearly shaken, began to hesitate. He stuttered, apologizing, but it was too late. His words, which had once been filled with derision and pride, no longer carried weight. Khabib didn't need to respond to the apology. He didn't need to support the man's attempt to save face. The moment had passed, and the man knew it. As silence reigned in the cabin, it became clear. This wasn't just a conflict between two people. This was a clash of worlds. On one side was arrogance born of ignorance, loud self-assertion based on false bravado. On the other side was quiet strength rooted in years of sacrifice, focus, and discipline. The contrast was stark, and the result was inevitable. Khabib's ability to remain calm, his restraint in the face of provocation, completely disarmed the man. There was no need for a physical confrontation. Khabib had already won without a single blow, and at that moment the other passengers realized something. Respect is not given on the basis of status or wealth, but on the basis of strength of character. And Khabib had just shown them what real strength looked like. When the tension seemed to subside and the situation returned to normal, something unexpected happened. The man, still clearly shaken by the interaction with Khabib, nervously adjusted the collar of his suit and fidgeted in his seat, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. What he didn't know was that this confrontation wasn't over yet, at least not in the heat imagined. Khabib, still holding the man's piercing gaze, turned away without saying a word. The man, now feeling a strange mixture of relief and humiliation, tried to breathe easier. Maybe the moment was passing. Khabib had decided to ignore it after all. But before the man could gain a false sense of security, Khabib did something that left everyone in the cabin completely speechless. Instead of returning to his seat, Khabib walked to the front of the cabin where the flight attendants were preparing drinks. A few whispers passed among the passengers, but no one said a word. It seemed as if the drama was over. But then Khabib's voice came from nowhere, clear and strong, addressing the entire salon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a calm but commanding tone, "I know that some of you are wondering if this is how we resolve issues in life, through insults and anger." The cabin became completely quiet. Passengers who had been whispering among themselves immediately fell silent, their eyes fixed on Khabib. The atmosphere, which seemed to have calmed down, suddenly changed again, but this time not because of fear, because of curiosity. Everyone was waiting to see what Khabib would say next. The man who had insulted him squirmed in his seat, unsure if Khabib was going to challenge him to a fight again or if he was in for more embarrassment. But Khabib's next words were the exact opposite of everything the man expected. "We can fight, yes," Khabib continued, "but the real power is in not doing it." His gaze slid around the cabin, meeting the eyes of several passengers. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. My actions speak louder than words." He was silent for a moment, allowing the words to reach his listeners. The flight attendants standing to the side watched silently, sensing the seriousness of the moment. And for those of you who might have thought this was an act of kindness, Khabib added, "Don't mistake my silence for weakness. Sometimes not reacting is the strongest thing you can do. It leaves your opponent with nothing but his own words to respond to." The turnaround wasn't just in Khabib's actions. It was in the message he delivered. What began as a moment of tension and potential conflict turned into an unexpected lesson. The passengers who had been nervously watching Khabib's every move now pondered his words, realizing that his strength was not in the power he had over the man who had insulted him. It was in his ability to remain calm, to turn the other cheek when provoked, and to use the situation to remind others of a more important lesson. The man who had been so cocky and confident now sat perfectly still. He had no objections or answers. His former arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of discomfort. He had expected a physical confrontation, something to validate his own ego, but instead he had to contend with his own pride and the consequences of his careless words. In that quiet and tense moment, it was clear. Khabib hadn't just won a battle with the man who had his insulted. He won over the entire salon. His silence, his composure, and the wisdom in his words turned the situation around in ways no one could have predicted. This man had underestimated not only Khabib, but the true power of restraint. The turnaround wasn't physical confrontation. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was the realization that Khabib had taught everyone on board far more important lesson than they ever imagined. Sometimes the most shocking thing you can do in a moment of conflict is to do nothing at all, and by doing so, you win without lifting a finger. The cabin remained still as Khabib's words hung in the air, a quiet but powerful lesson taking hold of the passengers. The tension that had once filled the space was now replaced by an awkward silence. The man who had insulted Khabib froze in his seat. His face turned pale. His former bravado was irretrievably shattered. He looked around nervously, but no one met his gaze. The passengers who had been watching this exchange of remarks were now immersed in their own thoughts, pondering the profound turn of events. Khabib, with his calm demeanor and unwavering presence, had achieved what many would have thought impossible. Without raising a hand, without saying anything but a few carefully chosen words, he disarmed the most arrogant man in the room, and in doing so, he made an unforgettable impression on everyone aboard the plane. The flight attendants, who were silently watching, exchanged glances, but they too remained calm. Seemed that they had witnessed something they would never forget. Khabib's grace under pressure brought an air of respect back into the cabin, and it wasn't just directed at him. The passengers now understood that strength is not always shown through power and dominance. It lies in the restraint to keep oneself from being provoked, in the wisdom to see beyond the surface of a situation. After a long pause, Khabib turned and walked back to his seat. As he did so, the man who had insulted him, now full of a sense of deep regret, looked up for a moment. He tried to speak, perhaps to apologize, but Khabib didn't look back. He had said what he needed to say, and now he was happy to let the man deal with the consequences of his own actions. Khabib didn't want an apology, didn't need an excuse. His message was delivered loud and clear, and it was the man's responsibility to reflect on it. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. The atmosphere in the cabin was completely changed. The passengers, once immersed in their worlds, now found themselves in silence, pondering Khabib's wisdom. The businessman who had previously boasted loudly of his connections now sat with his eyes downcast, absent-mindedly tapping his fingers on the armrest, probably reconsidering his own views on respect and humility. The middle-aged man who had originally insulted Khabib remained silent for the rest of the flight. He had once been defiant, eager to demonstrate his superiority, but he was a different man now. He had learned through bitter experience that arrogance had a price, and in his case, that price was much higher than he had ever anticipated. He glanced at Khabib few times during the flight, but the champion paid him no further attention. It seemed that the lesson had already been taught, and there nothing more to say. As the plane descended, preparing for landing, the once noisy atmosphere of the first-class cabin turned into something almost reverent. Passengers who had previously been lost in their own worlds now exchanged polite nods, smiles, and quiet conversations. No one dared to bring up the incident. They didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned, and it was clear that Khabib had left an indelible mark on everyone on board. When the plane finally landed, Khabib was one of the first to gather his belongings. He moved with the same quiet confidence that had characterized him throughout the flight. The other passengers, sensing his calm presence, stepped aside, giving him space as he walked to the gate. There were no autographs or grand gestures. Khabib didn't seek attention. He never did. He simply walked forward, head held high, satisfied in the knowledge that he had done more than just win a verbal battle. He had taught a lesson that no one would soon forget. The man who had insulted him didn't utter a word as the flight came to an end. He tumbled out of the plane, still crushed by the realization that his arrogance had cost him more than he could have imagined. But as he stepped off the plane, he realized one thing for sure. Sometimes true strength lies in knowing when not to fight and in the quiet strength of self-control. When Khabib stepped off the plane into the busy terminal, he did so without fanfare, without the need for confirmation. His reputation already spoke for itself, and as other passengers quietly stepped off after him, they knew they had witnessed something rare, an unforgettable lesson in strength, humility, and grace under pressure. Khabib's actions didn't just resolve the conflict. They transformed into something more, something that will resonate long after the plane has landed. The flight may have ended, but the repercussions of Khabib's response will be felt by everyone on board for a long time to come. As the story came to a close, it became clear that the true power of Khabib's actions was not in how he handled the man's insult, but in the wisdom and strength behind his silence. The lesson here is profound. You don't always have to respond to every provocation with anger or violence. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Khabib's restraint didn't just win him the respect of those around him. It has taught everyone that true strength comes from within, from the ability to remain calm under pressure and from the decision to rise above petty conflicts. In a world where we are often called upon to fight back, to stand up for ourselves at all costs, Khabib's example reminds us that true strength lies in control and discipline. His choice to keep his composure, to stand his ground without saying a word, spoke volumes about his character. It's easy to pounce on an insult, to react in the heat of the moment, but those actions rarely lead to anything meaningful. Khabib showed us that sometimes the most effective way to resolve conflict is to let your silence speak louder than any words. In our own lives, we encounter moments of provocation, whether in personal relationships, at work, or even in everyday situations. The question is, how do we react? Do we let our emotions take over, or do we rise above and stay true to our values? Khabib's story serves as a powerful reminder that we don't have to be in every fight. Sometimes victory lies in simply not fighting. So what do you think? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had a chance to react but chose not? How did that decision change the outcome? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of restraint and self-control, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with someone who might need it. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to more powerful lessons like this one and join us as we explore unexpected moments that teach us life's greatest truths. Greatest truths. Greatest truths. Greatest truths.